In the vast chronicle of British royalty, certain names echo across centuries: Elizabeth, Victoria, Anne. These women left indelible marks on history. But nestled deep in the dusty corners of medieval archives lies the story of a girl whose name barely survived time's erosion. Her name? Mary de Coucy. Once Queen Consort of Scotland and later England's youngest widow, Mary's life remains one of the most poignant and overlooked chapters in royal history. She was a child given a crown, a title, and a throne she could barely see over, then quietly erased. Born sometime around 1218 in France, Mary came from noble blood. Her father was Enguerrand III de Coucy, one of the most powerful French lords of the 13th century, known as the Scourge of the Clergy. Her mother, Marie de Montmirail, hailed from a similarly prestigious line. The Coucy family's castle was a towering fortress, rivaling many royal palaces, standing proudly as a symbol of ambition and power. It was from this influential heritage that Mary entered the brutal and political world of medieval marriage alliances. In those days, noble children were not raised with dreams of personal fulfillment. Their futures were bartered in the corridors of diplomacy and power. For Mary, that moment came shockingly early. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed to Alexander II, King of Scotland. The marriage wasn't about love or companionship. It was about forging a strategic alliance between Scotland and France to counterbalance the looming influence of England. In the 13th century, such an alliance could mean the difference between war and peace. Alexander II was no young boy. He was in his mid-30s at the time, a seasoned monarch. He had already seen battles, betrayals, and courtly intrigue. His first wife, Joan of England, daughter of King John and sister to Henry III, had recently died without bearing an heir. Alexander needed a new queen and potential mother to a future Scottish monarch. Political calculations pointed to Mary de Coucy. We must pause here to absorb the reality of what this meant. A 6-year-old girl, born in the quiet halls of Coucy, was now bound to a man nearly 6 times her age, set to become Queen of Scotland. She would leave behind her family, her language, and her homeland for the foreign, often brutal, courts of medieval Scotland. Her childhood would be replaced by the heavy expectations of queenship. Mary's name rarely appears in grand tales or sweeping historical dramas. Unlike Eleanor of Aquitaine or Margaret Tudor, she didn't command armies or shape policy. But that doesn't make her story any less compelling. In fact, her silence in the record is exactly what makes her so haunting. Why did a queen simply disappear? Why did the girl who wore the crown fade from memory? The records tell us that the marriage was formalized in 1239, and Mary was brought to Scotland shortly thereafter. The journey from northern France to Edinburgh would have taken weeks. And for a child, it must have been overwhelming. Imagine the scene. A tiny figure cloaked in fine silks, disembarking at Leith or Berwick, met by trumpets and noblemen who bowed to her with reverence she could barely understand. Behind the royal procession was a girl who had played with dolls only months before. Now, she was royalty. The wedding itself was a lavish affair. Chronicles from the period mention feasts, ceremonies, and noble attendance. But what they omit is any detail of Mary's thoughts, her fears, or her understanding of what was happening. Historical silence often tells its own story, one of disempowerment, especially for young women whose lives were scripted for them. Mary became queen consort, but as was customary in such unions, she did not immediately live with her husband. She likely remained under the care of tutors, ladies-in-waiting, and nurses, while being groomed for her eventual role as wife and queen. Her presence in court was ceremonial more than practical. She was a symbol, a living treaty between France and Scotland. What makes Mary's story even more tragic is the brevity of her queenship. Just 10 years old when her husband died, Mary became a widow before reaching adolescence. In an instant, she transitioned from royal bride to political liability. Without a son or any established power base in Scottish court, she was essentially disposable. Her title was gone, her status diminished, her purpose fulfilled and erased. But Mary's story does not end here. In the following segments, we will explore what became of her after the king's death, how her memory was buried by shifting dynasties, and what her tale says about the forgotten women of royal history. In the shadow of the Scottish Highlands and the ancient stone walls of ruined castles, Mary de Coucy's name whispers still. It is faint, fleeting, but it is there. And here, in the Crit Stories, we bring her story to light. History often celebrates the drama of battles and the grandeur of kings, but rarely does it pause to consider the quiet tragedies that unfold in royal nurseries. In the 13th century, the cries of newborns were often followed not by lullabies, but by contracts, seals, and political calculations. And for young Mary de Coucy, her childhood was interrupted before it truly began, when her future was signed away in ink before she could even spell her own name. Mary's early years were spent within the walls of the mighty Chateau de Coucy in northern France. Her father, Enguerrand III, was not just a baron. He was a warlord in his own right, known for his fierce independence from both the French crown and the papacy. He ruled the fortress of Coucy with nearly king-like authority. The castle itself was enormous and intimidating, with walls soaring over 100 feet high. It stood as a symbol of the Coucy family's might and ambition, an ambition that extended to marrying their daughters into royalty. We don't know exactly when the match between Mary and Alexander II was proposed, but we do know the why. Scotland, surrounded by two powerful forces, England to the south and Norway to the north, needed diplomatic allies. The French nobility, likewise, saw value in aligning with distant kingdoms like Scotland to project their influence beyond the borders of France. Mary, as a young and unmarred noble daughter of high standing, was a perfect pawn. At the time of the betrothal, Mary was likely around 5 or 6 years old. Alexander II was 44. The age difference would raise eyebrows today, but in medieval Europe, such unions were not unusual. A child bride was seen as politically flexible, moldable, and most importantly, loyal. She would be raised in the traditions of her husband's court and owe her status entirely to the alliance forged through marriage. In this context, Mary's life was never really hers to begin with. Her existence was mapped out in the offices of strategists and clergymen. Even as she played in the halls of Coucy, her future was being determined in distant cities she had never heard of. Childhood in medieval nobility was a fleeting phase, especially for girls. Unlike boys who might train in arms or serve as pages to build their futures, noble girls were trained in obedience, decorum, piety, and the art of silent suffering. Once the marriage negotiations were finalized, likely around 1236, Mary's education would have shifted. She would have begun learning Scottish customs, royal protocols, perhaps even English or Latin. While she likely spoke Old French fluently, the language of the Scottish court would have presented a challenge. Linguistically, culturally, and emotionally, Mary was about to be uprooted. By 1239, the marriage was official. Mary was sent north to become Queen Consort of Scotland. But what did that mean for a child barely able to hold a quill? It meant separation from her family. It meant living in a foreign land among strangers. It meant being a symbol of peace while understanding little of the conflicts that demanded such a union. Child marriages in medieval Europe were not typically consummated immediately. That would occur only after the girl reached puberty, usually around 12 or 13. In the meantime, the child wife would be kept under supervision, sometimes in a separate household or in the queen's own apartments. Her presence at court, though ceremonial, served political ends, a reminder to foreign dignitaries of the alliance forged with the powerful Coucy family. For Alexander II, the marriage was a political reset. His first wife, Joan of England, had died without producing an heir, leaving the Scottish succession uncertain. By marrying Mary, he hoped to cement foreign alliances and produce a son. Yet there is no evidence that Mary and Alexander ever had children. The king's sudden death in 1249 cut that possibility short. Mary, not yet 11, became a child widow, her title hollow, her purpose spent. But in 1239, that future was still unknown. Mary entered Scotland as a bride, a queen, no less. She may have worn a velvet gown, walked under garlands, and been toasted by the nobles of Edinburgh. But behind the ceremonial glory was a child likely confused, frightened, and overwhelmed. Her dolls were replaced with diplomacy, her bedtime stories with prayers for the kingdom, her toys with tiaras that never quite fit. And yet, history records none of her feelings. Mary left behind no letters, no journals, no first-hand accounts. Her voice is absent from the archives. She exists only in the margins of royal charters, where her name is listed as the king's consort, a technical title rather than a lived experience. The silence is deafening. The idea of childhood as a protected, joyful phase of life is a modern invention. In Mary's time, childhood was short, and for noble girls, it was often bartered away. Her story, so quiet, so easily dismissed, offers a powerful counter-narrative to the glamorous image of medieval royalty. Behind every royal alliance, every treaty sealed with marriage, was a child who gave up everything for a crown they barely understood. In the next segment, we'll follow Mary as she leaves the comfort of Coucy behind and steps into the harsh, cold world of the Scottish court. A foreign land, a foreign language, and a throne built for someone else's ambition awaited her, and with it, the shadow of a future she never chose. The winds across the English Channel carry more than just sea spray. They've long been the bearers of ambition, bloodlines, and secrets. And in 1239, they carried a young French girl, barely 10 years old, on a journey that would transform her from a noble's daughter to the queen consort of a distant, divided kingdom. Mary de Coucy was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, crossing into a world where power meant survival and politics was deadlier than war. Scotland awaited her, but so did isolation, suspicion, and a crown too heavy for a child's head. Imagine the voyage, a fleet of royal ships departing from a French port, carrying Mary and her small entourage of guards, priests, and attendants. The sea was unpredictable in those days, cold, wild, and perilous. Her passage to Scotland, though ceremonial in design, was physically taxing and psychologically overwhelming. Every wave pushed her farther from her family, her culture, her language, and her identity. Ahead of her was a marriage to a man she had never met. King Alexander II, a ruler nearly 4 decades her senior. Scotland in the mid-13th century was a kingdom of contrasts. While parts of the lowlands mirrored Norman England with stone castles and courtly rituals, much of the highlands and islands were rugged, remote, and still governed by tribal allegiances and ancient customs. Alexander II had spent much of his reign trying to consolidate control, particularly in territories claimed by Norway, like the Hebrides and Western Isles. His kingdom was far from unified, and into this turbulent landscape arrived a child bride from France. Mary's reception in Scotland was likely grand but also tinged with political caution. Foreign queens were often viewed with suspicion. Her father, Mary de Coucy, though powerful, had no direct interest in Scottish governance. She had no influential allies at the Scottish court, and no cultural ties to the people she was expected to rule beside. In truth, Mary's arrival was more symbolic than strategic, a beautiful gesture on paper, but a complication in practice. Still, the Scottish court had little choice but to honor the alliance. A formal wedding took place, likely at Roxburgh Castle or in Edinburgh. Chroniclers mention celebrations, feasting, and an abundance of pageantry. Mary, robed in imported silks and adorned with gold jewelry from the Coucy treasury, must have looked like a doll placed on a throne. But beneath the velvet and diamonds was a girl silently grieving the loss of her childhood. Because of her age, Mary would not have moved immediately into the king's chambers. It's likely she lived in a separate household with tutors, ladies-in-waiting, and governesses. She would have been instructed in Scottish customs, court manners, and the languages spoken at court, Scots and Latin, perhaps even Norse in certain circles. Her days would have been structured but lonely, her nights filled with prayers for understanding. Alexander II, though a capable and sometimes fierce ruler, was known to be pragmatic. He needed an heir, and Mary's youth delayed that necessity. Still, he saw the alliance as a long-term investment. In the meantime, he continued his campaigns to strengthen Scotland's autonomy. Mary was often left in royal castles, while Alexander traveled to remote regions of the kingdom, asserting power and putting down rebellion. While she may have attended royal functions, banquets, ceremonies, and processions, her voice in courtly matters would have been minimal. Unlike later queens who wielded influence behind the scenes, Mary was too young, too foreign, and too isolated to command much power. Her role was largely ornamental. She was a living emblem of a fragile alliance, not a political actor in her own right. Still, She was queen consort. Her name appeared beside the king's on charters and public proclamations. Her presence at court was enough to remind foreign envoys that Scotland had friends beyond the English crown, and her youth offered the promise of fertility and the continuation of the royal line. Hope, however distant, rested on her shoulders. There are no surviving personal letters or writings from Mary during this time. No diary entries, no poetry, no intimate glimpses into her thoughts. But if we read between the lines of history, her silence is telling. This was a girl trained to endure, not to speak out. In a land of stone walls and colder politics, Mary de Coucy learned to vanish into protocol. But even amid the loneliness and language barriers, she was adapting. Some reports suggest that Mary may have taken a liking to the Scottish countryside. Perhaps she found some freedom in the wild beauty of the lochs and hills, an echo of the forests near Coucy. Perhaps, too, there was a bond, however formal, between her and Alexander. For all his age and responsibilities, the king may have offered moments of kindness to the girl fated to become his wife. But this chapter of Mary's life, as brief as it was, would soon come to an end. In 1249, Alexander II died suddenly while campaigning in the Hebrides. Mary, not yet 11, became the Queen Dowager of Scotland, a widow before reaching adolescence. The alliance had delivered no heir, no dynasty, no lasting legacy. She was now caught in a kingdom that no longer needed her. Her role had expired, her influence non-existent. What was to become of the child widow? Where would she go? And who would remember her name? In the next segment, we will explore the aftermath of the king's death and how Mary's fragile place in history nearly disappeared entirely. The year was 1249. The Scottish king, Alexander II, was dead, struck down by illness while on a campaign in the Hebrides, far from the capital. His death marked a turning point in Scotland's political landscape, and for one young girl, it also marked the abrupt collapse of the only identity she had been taught to wear. At just 10 years old, Mary de Coucy became a widow. The Queen of Scotland, whose role was always ceremonial and symbolic, now had no throne, no husband, and no clear future. She had worn a crown too early, and now she had lost it before even learning its weight. Alexander's death came as a shock to the Scottish court. The king had been vigorous and determined in asserting Scotland's sovereignty. His death left the kingdom vulnerable, especially because Mary had not yet borne an heir. Instead, the throne passed to his son from his first marriage, Alexander III, a boy of only 7 years. This meant Scotland was now ruled by a minor, and the regency would be fiercely contested by rival factions. But where did that leave Mary? Technically, she was now the Queen Dowager, widow of the deceased monarch, but unlike older queens dowager who could wield influence as mothers of the next king or steward of royal households, Mary had no such leverage. She was, after all, still a child herself. Without children, political alliances, or native ties, her usefulness at the Scottish court was over, and so she was quietly sidelined. It's unclear how long Mary remained in Scotland after Alexander's death. Some historical accounts suggest she was allowed to reside temporarily at one of the royal castles, perhaps Stirling or Edinburgh, before arrangements were made for her to return to France. Whatever the case, she would not remain in Scotland for long. The court no longer had a role for her, and her presence was more a reminder of failed diplomacy than a living legacy. Imagine the psychological impact. Mary had been brought to a foreign land, taught new customs, dressed in royal silks, and made to perform the rituals of a queen, only to be unceremoniously cast aside when her royal purpose expired. Her titles meant nothing now. Her lessons in protocol, her courtly French manners, her rehearsed smiles at banquets, none of it would matter anymore. Her crown had turned to dust. For medieval girls like Mary, there was rarely a second act. Most widowed child brides were either forced into convents or remarried swiftly to another nobleman to serve another alliance. But Mary's fate would diverge from the norm. She returned to France, not as a queen, but as a daughter of Coucy. There, in the lands of her father, in Guerin III, she could still claim noble blood and enjoy some measure of respect. Yet she had seen and experienced something very few in her world had: the cold mechanics of political marriage, the hollow grandeur of royal life, and the terrifying loneliness of losing everything before adolescence. Back in Coucy, Mary became what many medieval women did in times of social ambiguity. She turned toward the church. Historical records suggest that she did not immediately enter a convent, but her later life was marked by religious patronage and a quiet withdrawal from political life. In this way, she vanished from the public eye. Historians know almost nothing about her teenage years, and even less about her thoughts. She never remarried, nor did she ever publicly assert herself in French or Scottish politics again. This raises a deeper question. Was Mary forgotten by design, or was she erased by the system that used her? Queens without heirs often drifted into oblivion in medieval chronicles. Women were remembered through their sons, their scandals, or their saintliness. Mary had none of these markers. She was not a mother, not a sinner, and not a martyr. She was simply a ghost of courtly ambition, a queen who reigned without ruling, and who was widowed without being remembered. Yet, in that erasure lies a powerful story. Mary de Coucy represents an entire class of noble women. Young girls shuffled between thrones, stripped of agency and cast aside when their value diminished. They were expected to serve silently, to bear heirs without complaint, and to vanish without protest. And many of them, like Mary, did. The silence of her life speaks volumes. It reveals the transactional nature of royal alliances. It exposes the fragility of queenship when not backed by bloodlines or political influence. It shows us how history prioritizes power over humanity. But Mary's story doesn't end entirely in shadows. Her quiet return to France gave her something she hadn't had in Scotland: stability. No longer a pawn on a geopolitical chessboard, she lived out her days in relative peace. In time, she would come to be known not for the crown she briefly wore, but for the dignity with which she wore her obscurity. She died in 1285, outliving her husband by over 35 years. By then, Alexander III had died, his heirs lost, and Scotland had plunged into a succession crisis that would spark wars and foreign invasions. The kingdom Mary had briefly called home would know no peace for generations. But Mary herself would pass quietly, her name barely mentioned in the chronicles of her time. In our next segment, we'll explore Mary's return to France and how she found a different kind of sanctuary far from the thrones and titles that once defined her. Mary de Coucy's departure from Scotland was quiet, almost spectral. There were no banners waving in farewell, no great farewell processions. The political alliance that had brought her to the Scottish throne was dead, buried alongside her husband, King Alexander II. She was 10 years old and already a widow, no longer needed, no longer queen, and no longer safe in a kingdom divided by power struggles over the young Alexander III. The crown she had once worn so briefly was now passed on to another, and Mary was left with little more than a memory of a foreign throne, and a name no one seemed eager to remember. She returned to France by sea, carried back across the waters that had once stolen her childhood. Home, in theory, but which home could she truly call her own? Coucy Castle, the massive fortress of her father and Guerin III, rose from the northern plains like a mountain of ambition and nobility. But Mary was no longer just a daughter of Coucy. She was a Queen Dowager of Scotland, a title with no power, no influence, and no place at a French court that regarded her marriage as a failed experiment in diplomacy. In the echoing halls of Coucy-le-Tour, Mary was likely received with courtesy but not celebration. Her father, a powerful baron and military commander, was renowned for his strategic brilliance and iron will. Yet he too was a realist. His daughter had returned without the Scottish crown, without an heir, and without prospects. To Guerin, Mary was still blood, but perhaps also a reminder of a deal that had brought prestige but little reward. And yet it was in these halls, removed from the thrones of kings, that Mary found a kind of quiet salvation. While there are no surviving letters or diaries, the chronicles hint at her involvement in the daily life of her family estate. As she matured, Mary may have taken on responsibilities managing the household, overseeing the lands, and directing religious endowments. In medieval France, noble women, especially those unattached to marriage, often turned toward ecclesiastical patronage and charitable works. Mary would have been no exception. By her late teens, Mary could have chosen one of two paths: remarriage or religious devotion. But she chose neither in the traditional sense. Whether this was her decision or one made for her remains unknown. There are no records of further marital alliances, no engagements to noblemen, no hints of another political match. Instead, Mary appears to have embraced a third path, a quiet existence rooted in piety and autonomy. While she did not take the veil as a nun, she became closely associated with the Abbey of Villers, a Cistercian monastery near her family's lands. There, she may have sponsored works of devotion, helped copy or illuminate manuscripts, or donated funds for the upkeep of its buildings and gardens. This kind of semi-religious life allowed Mary to exist in a space that afforded her some status and respect while shielding her from the turbulence of courtly politics. But what must it have been like to live with the ghosts of her own past? She had once been called Queen of the Scots. She had walked the echoing chambers of Edinburgh Castle, been served by foreign courtiers, attended royal ceremonies. She had felt the eyes of an entire kingdom upon her, curious, expectant, and often critical. And now, in the calm solitude of Coucy or the hushed cloisters of Villers Abbey, those eyes were long gone. Only Mary would carry the weight of those memories. Only Mary would remember the loneliness, the confusion, and the crushing silence that followed Alexander's death. As the decades passed, the world around her changed. Alexander III came of age and ruled over Scotland with strength and independence. England waged new wars, and France itself crept toward crisis. The fragile peace of Europe was cracking, and Mary, though far from the centers of power, would have heard the rumblings. She may have corresponded with distant relations, kept up with the affairs of her noble cousins, or listened to the Abbey's priests recount news from distant cities. But she no longer played a role in any of it. Her name was absent from royal decrees. No portraits were commissioned. No poet sang of her sorrow or survival. She had become a relic in her own lifetime, a piece of a forgotten puzzle that once mattered and now sat dusty on the shelf of history. Yet this retreat from public life was not necessarily a defeat. In choosing not to remarry or chase influence, Mary preserved a rare and precious thing in medieval nobility, her dignity. She did not allow herself to be bartered again. She did not enter a second political marriage that might have made her a pawn in someone else's strategy. She lived on her own terms in the shadows, but with agency. Mary de Coucy died in 1285, outliving many of the kings and nobles who had once considered her a valuable alliance. Her grave is believed to lie in France, possibly in a chapel attached to the Coucy estates or near the abbey she supported. No grand monument was erected. No fanfare followed her death. But in the quiet stone of that grave lies a story that deserves to be remembered. In the next segment, we'll explore what became of Mary's legacy or lack thereof, and how history nearly erased a girl who was once England and Scotland's youngest queen. Mary de Coucy, queen at 6, widow at 10, and forgotten soon after, stands today as one of the most obscure royal figures in British and French history. Her story has no statues, no stained glass tributes, and few written records. Her name is absent from school books and rarely mentioned in genealogies. How is it that someone who once wore a crown, walked among kings, and carried the expectations of two nations could all but disappear from the annals of history? The answer lies not in dramatic scandal or royal disgrace, but in silence, a deep, unyielding silence that surrounded Mary's life after a brief tenure as Queen of Scots. And that silence wasn't accidental. In medieval Europe, the stories that endure were those that served a political, dynastic, or moral purpose. Kings were remembered for their wars, queens for their wounds, saints for their suffering. Mary was none of these. She bore no children. She launched no political intrigues. She didn't marry again, ascend another throne, or found a religious order. She was not martyred, nor scandalized. In a world obsessed with legacy, she left none behind, at least not in the traditional sense. And so, history simply looked away. But the truth is more complex. In many ways, Mary's erasure reflects a broader pattern in how we remember, or fail to remember, women of the medieval world, particularly those who did not fulfill the narrow roles defined for them by court chroniclers, priests, and poets. A queen who neither birthed an heir nor died tragically was often relegated to the margins of record-keeping. Take a moment to think of the queens you know from history. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who shaped empires, and Bullen, who ignited religious revolution. Catherine de' Medici, who manipulated the French court with terrifying brilliance. All remembered, all written about. Why? Because they either left chaos, children, or controversy. Mary de Coucy did none of these, and thus her memory faded. Even the few chronicles that mention her do so sparingly. Scottish annals, such as the Chronica Gentiscatorum by John of Verdun, make only passing reference to Alexander II's second marriage. French records from Coucy mention her in the context of family endowments, not as a royal widow. There is no surviving portrait, no seal bearing her likeness, and no letters that scholars can definitively attribute to her. We know she existed only by the gaps she left behind. In this sense, Mary's story forces us to question how historical memory is built. What do we choose to remember, and what do we choose to forget? More importantly, who decides which stories are worth preserving? In Mary's case, her disappearance from historical narrative was not just a consequence of her quiet life. It was also a reflection of how records were kept and for what purpose. Royal scribes focused on succession and conquest. Court historians glorified their patrons. Church analysts concentrated on divine punishment or sanctified suffering. Mary didn't fit any of these molds. She was a child bride in a failed diplomatic marriage, useful only until her husband died. Once widowed, she became an inconvenient footnote. Even her death passed unnoticed. She died in 1285, outliving Alexander II by more than 3 decades. Yet there are no records of her being mourned in Scotland. No memorial masses. No official recognition from the Scottish crown. It's as if the years she spent as queen never happened. Her very identity was swallowed by the same political machinery that once elevated her. And yet, ironically, it's this disappearance that makes her story so compelling today. In an era when we are actively reclaiming the voices of women who were silenced by time, Mary emerges as a powerful symbol of forgotten history, a reminder that not all queens leave behind gold-threaded legacies. Some leave only the silence, and it's our job to listen to it. Consider also the tragedy wrapped in that silence. A child, stripped of her name and homeland, went to a foreign king, praised by courtiers, and then discarded when no longer needed. Her life might have been quiet, but it was not without meaning. In her silence lies a reflection of countless other young girls used as pawns in the royal chess game of medieval Europe. Raised to obey, sent to serve, and cast aside without ceremony. Today, scholars and storytellers are beginning to pay closer attention to these footnotes. Researchers of medieval women's history are combing through monastic registers, overlooked charters, and ecclesiastical archives to rediscover the lives that didn't make the headlines of their day. And in that work, Mary de Coucy is being gently pulled back into the light. Perhaps her greatest legacy is not in the power she held, but in the way her story challenges us to think differently about power itself, about who holds it, who documents it, and who is allowed to fade. In Mary's case, she may not have changed history, but her absence tells us volumes about the era she lived in. In the next segment, we'll step back and explore the royal machinery that shaped Mary's fate. What did it mean to be a child queen in the 13th century? What structures dictated her destiny and silenced her voice? Mary de Coucy's story, married at 6, widowed at 10, reflect a harsh reality of medieval royal politics. Child marriages were not only common but instrumental in shaping alliances, power, and territorial claims. To understand Mary's fate, we must examine the royal machinery that made children pawns in a game far larger than themselves. In the 13th century, monarchies were fragile and fiercely competitive. Alliances through marriage were essential diplomatic tools. Kings and queens didn't marry for love but for strategy, cementing peace treaties, securing borders, and forging bond between rival houses. The younger the bride or groom, the sooner an alliance could be solidified, warding off threats before they materialized. Mary was no exception. Born into the powerful Coucy family of France, her marriage to Alexander II of Scotland was designed to strengthen ties between two kingdoms often at odds with England and each other. At just 6 years old, she was betrothed and shortly thereafter married. In today's terms, this was unthinkable, but then it was a calculated political move. But what did it mean to be a child queen in the 13th century? Mary's marriage was likely a marriage by proxy initially, where the bride and groom were not even in the same room, their union conducted by representatives or symbolic ceremonies. Such unions were formal and binding, yet the couple often did not live together or consummate the marriage until years later. In Mary's case, it is unlikely she ever lived as a traditional queen consort with her husband. Alexander II was already an older man, over 40, when they married while she was still a child. The marriage was as much about politics as it was about securing heirs. Yet Alexander died just 4 years later, in 1249, leaving Mary a young widow before she even reached adolescence. This tragic brevity highlights another cruel aspect of child marriages among royalty, the unpredictability of life and the precariousness of these alliances. Kings were often older men, sometimes in poor health. Marrying a child bride was a gamble. If the king died early, the young queen could be left powerless, with her political usefulness evaporated overnight. What then happened to these child queens? Some remarried swiftly, used again as diplomatic tools. Others, like Mary, were sent back to their families or kept under watchful eyes in distant courts. Their fate often hinged on whether they had borne heirs or maintained political influence. In Mary's case, there was no heir. Her young widowhood marked her as a liability rather than an asset. She became a political nonentity, a figure caught between her birth family and her former throne. Her silence in records reflects this liminal status, neither fully royal nor fully commoner, trapped in a twilight zone of medieval nobility. The machinery behind these marriages was relentless and impersonal. Marriages were brokered by councils, barons, and church officials. The Pope's approval was often required, as church law governed the legality of unions, especially those involving children. Yet even the church tolerated and facilitated child marriages, provided they were not consummated before the age of consent, typically around 12 to 14. Beyond legality, there were cultural expectations. Noble girls were groomed from birth to become pawns in these dynastic games. They were educated in courtly manners, languages, and religious instruction, not for personal growth, but to fulfill their roles as political assets. Mary would have been no different. The system placed enormous pressure on girls like Mary. Their childhood was cut short, replaced by a mantle of responsibility they could barely comprehend. They were expected to represent their families, serve foreign courts, and eventually produce heirs who would secure political legacies. Failures were often met with harsh consequences, disinheritance, exile, or worse. Yet amidst this machinery, some child queens demonstrated resilience and agency. While Mary's own life ended quietly, others like Eleanor of Provence, queen consort to Henry III of England, managed to wield influence behind the scenes despite early marriages. Their stories stand in contrast to Mary's precisely because they survived the machinery's crushing weight. Mary's story is a window into the cost of these alliances, the lost childhoods, the broken dreams, and forgotten faces behind history's grand narratives. It reminds us that beyond the thrones and crowns, there were real children with hopes and fears, thrust into roles they never chose. In the next segment, we will look closer at the political turmoil that engulfed Scotland after Alexander II's death, and how that shaped the fate of the kingdom and the memory of its youngest queen. The death of King Alexander II in 1249 plunged Scotland into a period of uncertainty and transition. For a nation that had just welcomed a young foreign queen, Mary de Coucy, into its royal fold, his sudden passing left a political void with far-reaching consequences. The kingdom was not only without a monarch, but also burdened with the loss of potential heir through Mary's childless marriage. Alexander II's reign had been marked by efforts to consolidate the Scottish realm and resist English encroachment. His diplomatic marriages were key to these aims, and his union with Mary de Coucy was no exception. However, his death left his son and heir, Alexander III, a mere 7 years old, too young to rule in his own right. In medieval Scotland, as elsewhere in Europe, a child monarch meant regency, an extended period during which others ruled in his name. This opened the door to factional disputes, noble rivalries, and external threats. The death of Alexander II thus triggered a fragile balancing act between competing interests within Scotland and pressures from neighboring England. Mary, the young widow queen, was sidelined almost immediately. Despite her royal status, her political influence evaporated with her husband's death. The Scottish crown belonged to Alexander III, Alexander II's son from his first marriage to Mary de Coucy's predecessor. Mary's role as queen consort was now irrelevant. Her place in the court diminished. The regency that governed on behalf of young Alexander III was fraught with challenges. Powerful nobles vied for control, while the English crown watched closely, ready to exploit any weakness. The internal power struggles threatened to destabilize the kingdom at a critical moment. Meanwhile, Mary's future remained uncertain. Widowed, childless, and foreign, she occupied a precarious position. The political machinations that once secured her marriage now abandoned her. Sources indicate she returned to her French family's estates, removed from Scottish political life and distant from the court she had briefly graced. This period saw the further marginalization of Mary's memory. Chroniclers focus on the regency and the young king's eventual ascendancy, not on the child queen whose brief marriage had been a footnote in the larger political narrative. Her story faded behind the more dramatic events unfolding in Scotland. Alexander III eventually assumed personal rule in 1262, bringing stability to the kingdom. His reign was marked by efforts to strengthen the monarchy and maintain Scottish independence, notably through his marriage to Margaret of England, a strategic alliance echoing the earlier Coucy marriage but with much greater success. Yet the shadow of Mary de Coucy's brief queenship lingered, largely unseen but not forgotten. Her life encapsulates the fragility of royal power, especially for women married into dynastic schemes. Her existence became a symbol of the many who were used and discarded in medieval political strategies. The crisis following Alexander II's death also underscores the vulnerabilities of medieval monarchies, how succession disputes, child kings, and regencies could weaken even well-established realms. Scotland's turbulent mid-13th century was a test of resilience that shaped the future of the nation. For Mary, this political turbulence meant anonymity. She was neither regent nor queen dowager with influence. Her widowhood rendered her invisible in the power struggles that defined the era. The machinery of monarchy had no place for a young widow without children or lands in Scotland. As the years passed, Mary's legacy was overshadowed by the grander narratives of Scottish kings and queens who followed. Her story became a whisper in the margins, a lost chapter in the nation's history, a queen lost in time. In the next segment, we will explore Mary's final years, the quiet life she led away from courts and crowns, and the mystery surrounding her death and burial. After the death of King Alexander II and the regency period for the young Alexander III, Mary de Coucy quietly slipped from the public eye. Unlike many queens of her time, whose later years were spent wielding power as regents or dowagers, Mary's life took a starkly different path, one marked by relative obscurity and a withdrawal from the political stage. Following her widowhood at around 10 years old, Mary returned to her family's estates in France. The Coucy family, known for their impressive castles and significant influence in northern France, provided her with shelter and security. However, this return did not restore her to any form of royal power or influence. Rather, it marked the end of her brief and tumultuous role as Queen of Scots. Records from the period are frustratingly sparse regarding Mary's later years. Unlike many royal widows who remarried or entered religious life, there is no evidence that Mary pursued either path. She seems to have lived a life largely detached from the courts of Europe, fading into the background of noble life in her homeland. This quiet life may have been by choice or necessity. Without children to secure her status and lacking political support in Scotland, Mary's options were limited. The social norms of the time often relegated widowed noble women, without heirs or roles within their natal families, with little power or independence. Despite her withdrawal, Mary's presence would still have been felt within the Coucy family circle. The Coucys were prominent feudal lords with vast estates and political clout. It is likely that Mary played a role in the management of family affairs or in religious patronage, as was common for noble women of the time. Yet these contributions remain undocumented and overshadowed by the lack of royal recognition. Mary's life after the throne underscores a broader theme in medieval history: the erasure of women's experiences who did not fit the dominant narratives. Her disappearance from official chronicles reflects the limited roles available to women and the narrow ways their stories were recorded. Even the details of her death remain vague. Historians place her death around 1285, but the exact circumstances are unknown. There is no known grave or memorial dedicated to her, and she left no descendants to champion her memory. This anonymity starkly contrasts with the prominence she once held as a crowned queen. Her passing without public mourning or royal ceremony reflects the transient nature of political power tied to marriage alliances. Mary's life was intertwined with the ambitions of kings and nobles, and when those ambitions shifted, so too did her fate. It was a common reality for many noble women of the medieval period. Yet, her story offers us a poignant reminder of the human cost behind political strategy. A child thrust into a royal role, whose potential was never fulfilled, and whose legacy was quietly erased by the passage of time. Mary de Coucy's final years, though cloaked in silence, enrich our understanding of medieval queenship childhood and the complexities of power and memory. Her life calls us to look beyond the grand tales of conquest and coronation to the quieter stories that shaped history in less visible but equally important ways. In the next and final segment, we will reflect on Mary's legacy and the lessons her story offers us today. A queen lost in time but not forgotten forever. Mary de Coucy's life is a haunting example of a queen lost in time. A young girl who wore the crown yet never truly ruled, a political pawn whose personal story faded into the shadows of history. But even in silence, her legacy speaks volumes about the realities of medieval power, childhood, and the often invisible roles of women in history. Her marriage at 6 and widowhood at 10 was more than personal tragedy. It was a reflection of a system that used children as diplomatic tools, disregarding their humanity for political gain. Mary's story reminds us how the ambitions of kings and nobles shaped lives in ways that were both intimate and brutal. Despite the brevity of her queenship, Mary's existence challenges the grand narratives that dominate royal histories, the tales of conquerors, kings, and celebrated queens. She represents those who were sidelined, forgotten, or erased, yet whose lives reveal the true complexities beneath royal splendor. Mary's disappearance from the historical record after her widowhood highlights how easily women's stories could be lost, especially when they lacked heirs or political influence. Her quiet retreat to the Coucy estates shows the limits of medieval queenship, especially for child brides caught in the crossfire of dynastic politics. Yet, there is power in remembering. Bringing Mary's story to light restores her voice, acknowledging the sacrifices and losses hidden behind royal alliances. It humanizes history, reminding us that behind every crown was a real person, with hopes, fears, and a life often shaped by forces beyond their control. Her life also prompts reflection on how history records and values different stories. The grand tales of kings and victorious queens often overshadow the experiences of those like Mary. As historians and storytellers, revisiting such forgotten figures helps us paint a more complete picture of the past. In a broader sense, Mary's story resonates today, reminding us to question power dynamics, the treatment of children, and the ways societies marginalize certain voices. Her story encourages empathy for those caught in political games and offers a timeless lesson on the human cost of ambition. Mary de Coucy, England's youngest widow and Scotland's forgotten queen, may have been lost in time, but she is not lost to us now. Her life, brief yet poignant, calls us to remember the untold stories that shape history's fabric. Thank you for joining the Crit Stories on this journey through the life of Mary de Coucy. If you found this story compelling, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history's forgotten and mysterious tales. Until next time, keep uncovering the stories that history tried to hide.